Good morning, everyone, and thanks for being with us for our Canberra Talks trade debate. I'm Andrea Tognoni, head of the Trade and External Relations practice at Canberra Associates, and I'm delighted to introduce a fantastic panel this morning who will unpack the secrets of the new EU trade strategy for us. As you know, about 5 years from the Trade for All strategy, the world is not quite the same. Brexit, Trump administration, COVID-19, and much more rocked our world. So we'll see if this new roadmap will help the EU to navigate this new trade tides. I won't take any more time from our speakers, just introduce them, even if they hardly need an introduction. We have with us Léa Auffret, Senior Trade Policy Officer and Team Leader at the European Consumer Organization, BEUC, Susan Dange, CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce to the EU, which she has been leading for almost 20 years and one of the top 20 women influencers in Brussels, Ignacio García Bercero, Director for Trade Strategy and Multilateral Affairs at DG Trade, and in his 25 years at the Commission, also known as Chief Negotiator for TTIP back then, as well as an expert on WTO and much, much more. Iuliu Winkler, a veteran member of the European Parliament for the EPP Group at his 4th legislature, currently Vice Chair of the International Trade Committee and former Minister for Trade of Romania. And last, but most definitely not least, our moderator, Alan Beattie, lead writer for Trade Secrets, the Financial Times daily newsletter on trade and globalization, previously International Economic Editor and World Trade Editor, who will steer the discussion for us. So on behalf of Canberra, thank you all for joining this morning. Alan, thank you, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Andrea. Well, as Andrea just said, we've had half a decade since the EU published its previous overall strategy on trade policy, which was quite snappily named Trade for All. Just making a list of the things that have happened since then. We've had Donald Trump, we've had the continued bypassing of multilateralism, we've had COVID, we've had the extraordinary economic contraction that came with it, we've had the continued rise of China, we've got heightened awareness, I think, across the world of the effects of climate change, and we've got the continuing shift of globalization from the physical to the digital. In the light of this, the EU has now updated its strategy. One thing that's also happened in the last half decade is it's got much less good at naming its trade strategies, because the current one labors under the title Open, Sustainable and Assertive Trade Policy. However, the ambition is undimmed. With this policy, the EU wants to simultaneously save the open trading system and the European economic recovery and multilateralism, the EU's own geopolitical credibility and the planet. You've had the guests introduced to you. The format of today is that we have 3 subject areas that I'll ask the panelists to talk about, perhaps with some follow-up, and then we'll have 15 minutes or so for question and answer from audience at the end. And you can submit questions using the Q&A function. So first of all, Ignacio, this is all your idea, this is all your fault. So let me ask you, first of all, what exactly is new from the previous strategy? What will we see over the last 5 years that we didn't see over the previous 5?
Ignacio, you're on mute.
Ignacio, you're still on mute. You're still on mute.
Okay, sorry. No, I mean, as you have said, Alan, we have designed this trade strategy very much taking into account that over the next 20 years, we are going to be facing 2 very fundamental factors. One is a major geopolitical conflict between the United States and China, which is having a significant impact on the rule-based trading system. And there is a major transformation of the global economy, taking into account the ambitions to achieve carbon neutrality, but taking into account also the very significant impact of digitalization. So these are the 2 mega trends, and these are trends that need to be reflected in how we do trade policy. What is therefore the new? A much, much stronger focus on the need to modernize the rules of international trade. This is going to be critical if we want to avoid a global fragmentation of the trading system. And that's why WTO reform is now clearly identified as the central priority for the trade policy. Something that, of course, we cannot do on our own, something that really it requires building alliances, working with others, which is a very fundamental change in terms of how we are going to develop into trade policy over the next few years. And that we have been putting a lot of focus about developing a strategy of alliance building to move forward on WTO reform. But certainly there's going to be a need to have a much closer integration between trade policy and other European economic policies. Trade policy is not going to be able to be autonomous. It is going to have to be much more closely integrated with our domestic policies relating to digitalization, relating to climate neutrality, and that is going to imply a different way of doing trade policy. I mean, just let me give you an example. If you look into important legislative initiatives which are mentioned in this communication, there are basically 5, and only one of them is actually led by trade. We have the border carbon adjustment measure, we have an instrument on deforestation, we have a due diligence legislation, we have a new anti-subsidies instrument, and we have an anti-coercion instrument. 5 major legislative initiatives, all of them with significant trade implication. Only one of them is an initiative which is led by DG Trade, but trade, of course, needs to be very closely integrated on how the other instruments are designed, precisely to be sure that they are compatible with our objective of having a trade policy which is open, sustainable, and assertive, which is why we have chosen this wonderful title, which I know you like a lot, Alan.
Thank you very much. Léa, can I ask you next? From my memory, Trade for All, there was a strong sense that that was focused on sort of discontent within the EU, discontent among consumers and among voters and citizens about the environmental impact of trade. Do you think the last 5 years have actually addressed those concerns? And what do you think this trade strategy says about those concerns in the future?
Yes, actually, we really like the Trade for All strategy because it was really rather looking at the acceptability of trade agreement, focusing on issues like being more transparent towards what DG Trade was negotiating on behalf of citizens. And of course, we've seen a lot of improvements since the publication of this strategy. But I have to say for the new strategy, it's true that we would have liked to see more flesh around what can trade policy do concretely for consumers, for instance, making it easier for consumers or more affordable to use their phone when the travel will be allowed again, reducing roaming fees, for instance, or having a specific chapter dedicated to consumers. So that's something that is, of course, missing from this strategy because it's looking at a different angle. However, when we look at the element in this new policy review, what we like is, as Ignacio was mentioning, this idea to better align trade policy with internal policy, including the Green Deal, for instance. But I agree that we completely need to modernize the WTO. We support the Commission's efforts in doing so, but aren't we here missing an opportunity to really modernize the core rules of the WTO? Because we're not looking really at rules, for instance, on technical barriers to trade or food safety. I say that because if the EU now would introduce, for instance, a new label to better inform consumers about the healthiest option when they want to buy food, the Nutri-Score, or they want to introduce a new right to allow consumers to have access to spare parts if they want to repair a product instead of buying a new one. So again, in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. Well, this could be very well seen in the WTO today as technical barriers to trade, because we have very old rules, to be honest, that are not really fit for today's challenges. So we think that this should be a new thinking also within this idea to reform the WTO, to look at that approach to really give the opportunity of the EU to achieve its objectives. And we also like the idea to have a more strategic approach towards cooperation between regulators and authorities in this new strategy. There was a heated discussion that we had for years with Ignacio, and here we really see the development in a positive way, because in this strategy we see the idea of the Commission to use trade deals as a vehicle to promote such cooperation between authorities led by regulators in parallel of trade agreements, and we have good success stories about it. For instance, the Canadian and EU market surveillance authorities are teaming up to remove dangerous products sold online. So that's concretely helping consumers and making them safer in the globalized and digitalized environment. But actually, I have a question on this for Ignacio later, because their strategy does not refer here to anything about transparency. We're going to have more dialogues on digital, sustainability, on health, very well. But how will we be aware as civil society of what will be discussed there? How will Parliament will be able to scrutinize what is happening? We do think that you need the same type of systematic transparency rules for international cooperation that you have for trade negotiations.
So let me pick up that particular issue and ask Iuliu about it, which is one thing I should have also mentioned that's happened over the last few years is that Parliament has become more and more assertive over trade policy, not just the environmental aspects, but also transparency. And of course, we're in the middle of this debate about the China and the China Investment Treaty. What do you think there is in this deal, in this strategy for Parliament and Parliament's role?
Well, assertivity is not only for our trade policy, but indeed, as you mentioned, Alan, it is for the Parliament also. And I think that it has begun after 2009, because if we look a little bit back, then we see the Lisbon Treaty changing the competencies of the Parliament, enforcing them in the field of trade. What we wish to do is not only monitoring the implementation, but also monitoring the enforcement, because as we see, this was one new issue, I would say, in the last 5 years. If we look back to the Trade for All strategy, it was, let me say, it was more about seeing that the WTO is in huge problems. Of course, we, the European Union, wanted always to be active in the WTO, but in the same time, we said we need to enforce our bilateral trade relations. So now we have the most formidable array of trade agreements in the world. And what we say here in the Parliament is that indeed it's about implementation of those agreements, better, more efficient implementation, open for SMEs, information for all, more transparency, as Léa has very correctly mentioned, and transparency is an issue for the European Parliament, as it is in generally for trade. But coming back to the new trade strategy, I would say it is about the transformation processes that we are in the middle of them, because what we need now, of course, the European Union, is a recovery from the economic crisis, which was, of course, induced by the coronavirus pandemic and all the global restrictions, but it's not rebouncing, or it's not about recovery which leads us back to 2019, for example. I would say it has to be a recovery which leads us into the future. It's something like a back to the future recovery, because we need, through the trade policy also, to support those two transformation processes. And obviously, I'm speaking about the digital, and I'm speaking about sustainability. So in the Parliament, yes, we are very attentive to those issues. We are also very exigent towards what the Commission can do when it looks at the trade policy as intertwined with the other policies of the European Union. Of course, it's a very lively debate about how much can you load on a single mule, how much can you put on trade policy, what expectations can you have only from trade policy alone. And I would say that this strategy also comes to clarify that trade policy is not working alone, but trade policy has to work in a wider media of also autonomous measures, trade or investment agreements, but also in relation with our foreign policy. And maybe what I miss a little bit from the trade strategy is also the part of security, because now we have new security challenges, and I think that those have to be, of course, or would have been maybe better addressed and more clearly addressed, this intertwining between the foreign policy, diplomacy, trade policy, and security needs of 21st century.
Great, that's very helpful. So Susan, let me just ask you a really basic question. Your members, your member companies, when they see something like this, do they actually think, here's something new, here's something we have to engage with? Or do they actually just think, oh, look, it's another whole load of words from the Europeans? and things will carry on as normal.
Yeah, thanks, Alan, and good morning, everybody. No, we're enthusiastic, Alan. We're enthusiastic, and just so we're clear, no, I think those probably on the line know how committed our members are to Europe. I mean, just as a quick reminder, our absolute mission here is building a strong and united Europe, and we're committed to the single market. That's why this organisation exists. So just to leave you with that, and what I would say with regard to this strategy, therefore, is that no, we input into the consultation. So we've been very active. So take it very seriously indeed, and we're awaiting with enthusiasm to see what would come out. So no, it's not just another piece of paper. Taking it very seriously. With that, what do we think? We're optimistic. Actually, we were positive. You know, positive. Welcome it in a very positive way. In that, I think it's been mentioned already by my previous panelists, but the strategy does indeed place the emphasis on green and digital. So that's very important to our companies, absolutely. It centers with what we've been stressing for the last sort of months and years, in fact, in all of our advocacy work. So that was one thing, you know, in terms of the strategy that we definitely support, and it's very coherent with what else is going on within the EU. To the comments previously made, I think it's very important that the trade policy is coherent with the economic recovery plans and other areas of work in the EU. Perhaps just picking out a couple of other points that we specifically welcome would be noting the emphasis on the reform of the WTO. Absolutely, the EU has to be ambitious there to strengthen the rules-based multilateral system. So that's what is key to our companies. We've got to also address unfair market practices. So the WTO has a huge role to play there. Another positive aspect for us was, of course, strengthening the transatlantic relationship. That was called out. So we welcome that. It's a critical inflection point at the moment. So very much welcome that. We believe we need to take advantage of rekindling the momentum that we currently have, Alan. So therefore, by calling it out in the trade policy strategy is important, because we believe, again, going back to climate together, we can tackle these challenges better together. We can't do them alone. Tackling climate change, tackling unfair trade practices, and also working together on global standards. Would also just like to call out as well that we agree, and it's stressed in the brief, in the trade strategy, working together with other like-minded partners generally. There was also mention in the strategy of the Trade and Technology Council. So we were supportive of that. We appreciate the mention there. We know the details have to be fleshed out, but very much see that as creating a forum now for some of the issues you mentioned in your opening with regard to digitalization. We have to face that together. So businesses, policymakers, and citizens. Perhaps if I can, just one comment on Léa's remark, and agree, you know, with regard to, there wasn't so much mention of workers, and perhaps of interest to everybody here, whether it's consumers. I mean, we haven't gone into depth on this, but there is also now, of course, the US trade strategy. And some of you might be aware that in the US trade strategy, which is actually very similar to the EU strategy, which is a positive sign, there is a very strong emphasis on workers and making sure that any trade strategy shows very strongly what the benefits are to them. So, I mean, I'll leave you with that, Alan. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much. Can I just stick with you as we go on to the next question, which is about open strategic autonomy and the sort of geopolitical security aspects to this. I mean, your members, obviously, in the US have been facing this for some time, and they've been dragged into the national security issue. You know, attempts by the previous administration, indeed possibly by this one, to push China out of supplies, etc., etc. All of this. Do you think that they will recognize in this the same kind of thing that they've been having to deal with at home, that it's quite hard if you're a big multinational now just to do business without taking account of the geopolitics and security implications of everything they're doing?
Yeah, no, I mean, indeed, I think, actually, we're just on strategic autonomy, Alan. We've been sort of quite cautious. We've been a little bit concerned about how this phrase, what it actually means, in terms of it now being, well, clearly now a guiding principle of what's happening in the EU. However, I think what has been good about how it's been defined now is the word open. So for us, the big concern is that strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty, whatever it may be, has to be open. think, our concern would be on supply chains. We've seen the impact of the pandemic has really sort of made us all aware of how intertwined we actually are. We've been quite concerned about this sort of retraction into being more resilient, absolutely, being more self-sufficient to a certain extent. But I think the absolute emphasis has got to be on the word, we've got to be open. I think the key here would be, we can see why regions might want to become more self-sufficient and dependent, but we don't think that anyone should be dependent or independent. It's all about interdependence. So I think my word here, that good and very reassuring that the strategy lays this out. We welcome that, but let's just be a little bit cautious. Let's remain outward. It's absolutely all about working with others. And perhaps from the business point of view, we feel we're so completely invested in the EU, as I mentioned at the beginning, that we're actually sort of really intertwined in Europe. So therefore, we believe we're actually strong contributors to the EU strategic autonomy itself. With regard to China, maybe I'll come to that later. I mean, I'll leave you with that for now, Alan. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So Ignacio, Iuliu brought up this issue of security and whether or not it's adequately addressed in the in the strategy. Now, let me be provocative and say that an economic bloc that has no army, no independent intelligence service, doesn't actually take the decisions on whether, for example, Huawei is allowed into 5G, and it doesn't have a big chunk of aid that it can use in a political way, all of these, unlike the US, isn't actually in a position to play a geopolitical role or to play a big security role. And it's asking, again, to quote Iuliu, it's asking trade policy to do too much. It's asking too much to be loaded onto this one thing. As a trade policy person, of course, rather than a security person, do you think you're being asked to do too much? And you're muted, Ignacio, you're muted again.
It is clear that there's a lot of expectations which are put on the trade policy, and that we need to navigate those expectations carefully. Now, it is, we have a strong trade policy. We have also a very significant role when it comes to the shaping of global regulations. And if you combine those two instruments together, you can certainly play a geopolitical role. But you have to be careful in how you articulate the role that you are playing at the geopolitical level. Now, a very important geopolitical function of the European Union is to shore up multilateralism. We have a fundamental political and economic interest in having a functioning multilateral rule-based system. And I think it's significant that at the same time that we issued this communication on trade policy, we issued a broader communication on effective multilateralism. And that's one of the key areas where we can have an influence, particularly, and that's also what we have identified WTO reform as being a fundamental strategic interest of the European Union. We want to avoid a fundamental fragmentation of the trading system. We know that there is a geopolitical conflict which has a security dimension, but we can also have very significant economic impact. And we think that the only way to tackle that is by ensuring that we modernize the rules of economic interaction. And that's why it's going to be so critical that we work together with the United States, that we work together with other like-minded countries within the framework of the WTO to develop those rules that can ensure a proper interface between market economies and non-market economies. Because let's be clear, China at this point in time is not a non-market economy, and that generates significant economic distortions. Now, we don't believe in decoupling. We don't believe that that is going to be the way forward. But in order to ensure fairness, in order to ensure a level playing field, you need to modernize the rules of the game. And that's what we would want very much to do within the WTO framework. And on that, we have actually put forward the idea that we would want to work with like-minded countries to start negotiation within the WTO framework of a plurilateral agreement on competitive neutrality. So that, if you want, is not geopolitical in the pure security dimension of it, but it is going to be critical to try to ensure that we can maintain a global trading system that manages the interface between the market and non-market non-market economies. Now, it is true that in the communication, we have not said a lot strictly on the security dimension, because this is an area on which we are really at the beginning of the process. It's only very recently that we introduced a framework for investment screening. It is only very recent that we modernized the European Union framework on export control. So we are not suggesting already at this point in time that this needs to be overhauled, because we need to get more experience about how these instruments are working. But for instance, we are proposing an anti-coercion instrument that would ensure that if the European Union or its member states are subject to threat to try to force us to modify our policies, that we have a rapid instrument of response fully in line with public international law. So this dimension is also part of the elements about how we ensure that we are cooperative, that we very much seek to work together with others. But if we are threatened, if we need to react, we have the tools to react, but always doing it in accordance with our commitments under international law.
Okay, Iuliu, I just wonder what you think of that response, and in particular, if you look at something like the CAI, like the EU-China Investment Treaty, do you see there geopolitical or foreign policy objectives overriding the commercial? Is the EU in danger of signing a thin deal, and indeed a deal without much protection for labour rights, just because it's keen to be a player in dealings with China?
Well, I think the EU-China investment agreement is a very good example about the fact that the EU trade policy cannot and should not be expected to solve alone a wide array of problems, but should be expected clearly to contribute hugely to solving those problems that are not only economical, not only trade, not only security, but also human rights problems, environment problems, and so on. And this is, I would say, this is quite a welcome thing that the CAI, the EU-China Investment Agreement, even if it's not an FTA, because it's not such thing, but it has a TSD chapter, a Trade and Sustainable Development chapter. This is a premiere, and as a matter of fact, is a premiere also globally, because all the other global players which have some agreements with China, it's also the United States. It's about the new regional cooperation in the Pacific, Asia Pacific, the RCEP, 15 countries, among them Australia, Japan, and others. Nobody has any trade and sustainable development chapter with respect of China. So now we have it on the table. Of course, it's a long process, and we will have to discuss, and already, as you can see, a very lively discussion has started, implying various political groups in the parliament and various stakeholders all around the European Union. And I say CAI is a very good example of the interdependencies, because one should judge the EU-China relation as absolutely not being equal to CAI. It's different things. So if we judge the EU-China relation, we have to look at the investment agreement, but we have to look at the second pillar, which are the EU autonomous measures, and Ignacio has just mentioned some of them. I would add also the upcoming due diligence legislation and others which are prepared by the Commission. They are asked by the Parliament. And then we have the third pillar, of course, which is international cooperation. First of all, WTO, and we need a functioning WTO. The European Union, it's an international organization if you take it as its nature. And of course, we need rules to play by, but those rules have to be for all the players. That's why the WTO comes with such a high relevance. But also we have our bilateral relationships. And let me start by the transatlantic relationship, because just let me tell you how optimistic was everybody in January in the European Parliament about the possibility that we can change course in our transatlantic relationship, which is absolutely needed, not only if we talk China, but in more broad sense, if we talk global relations, and if we talk this new reality, because we have to accept that we are in a new reality for trade. We are in a new reality for many things, but we are discussing now trade, and the expectation of our citizens in the European Union have to be met. The expectations of the companies also have to be met. When we discuss new legislation, we have to discuss feasibility, and also we have to discuss what happens on the ground where we want to influence realities. So it is very complex, it is very interdependent, and I think the China Investment Agreement will be a good example for this new type of relationship, where we need also a lot of work to understand better what is happening, but also we need to understand this openness. So the European Union has to cooperate when possible, has to act autonomously when needed, and has to step up these new 21st century realities of the new world of trade.
Let me just come back before I go on. Can I just come back briefly to Ignacio on that? Those questions on CAI, and in particular, were you surprised by the reaction to CAI? There was quite a strong reaction against CAI, I think, within the parliament and among some member states and among the public. What role do you think it's going to play?
Well, I think that the reaction was probably because this was seen in isolation and not as part of a much broader strategy about how we wanted to engage with China, but at the same time being clear that we want to have all the tools to defend our interests. And I think that if you actually look now into the totality, if you look at how these issues are being tackled in the new trade policy communication, you will see that on the one hand, of course, we refer to CAI and to the value that CAI has, and that the parts that would need to be done before the agreement is ratified. But at the same time, the communication is very clear that we think that the state capitalism system in China has been one of the major reasons why we have the current crisis in the WTO, that it's not going to be possible to reform the WTO without modernizing the rules to deal with the interactions with the state capitalism. And I think it is very, very clear in what we are saying on WTO reform, that we think that China needs to go way beyond what it has already committed in the CAI on issues like industrial subsidies, on issues like state-owned enterprises. The CAI is a good starting point, but it's by no means the end of what we wanted to secure from China. And by the way, we also think it's very important that China has taken for the first time commitments relating to both the protection of the environment and labor rights, including commitments relating to ratification. But we also say very clearly in our communication that we need to develop our own autonomous instruments to deal with concerns relating to labor rights. And we speak explicitly about the fact that there will need to be clear European Union legislation to tackle effectively the issue of forced labor. So I think that you really need to look into the whole picture, and it's true that the debate of the CAI was a little bit just to focus on one particular aspect, and hopefully now the thing can be seen in a broader perspective.
Okay, so Léa, are you concerned that with all this big focus on security, if it comes down to it, if there is a trade-off between doing something for geopolitical ends and staying true to the principles which do with consumers and labor and the environment and so on, are you concerned that those principles will get squeezed out?
Yes, we are actually, because we see this willingness on the EU side to reform the WTO, to also have a much more to revive the partnership with the US, which we perfectly understand, and we agree that it's going to be a nicer way to work with the new administration, especially because we are a member of this transatlantic consumer dialogue. But at the same time, what we see in both this willingness to speed up the process in the WTO and to improve the discussion with the US is that maybe we're going to speed up a bit too quickly, and not really take the necessary time to see what needs to be done for people, for workers, for consumers, and for the environment. Just to take an example, Susan, you mentioned the Trade and Tech Council that the EU has proposed to the US as part of this new cooperation agenda. very nice. But just to come back on the issue of transparency, for instance, we've been asking Ignacio, you know that several times to see what's in there. We still haven't any reply. So that's the type of thing we need really to see what's happening in there. And the EU needs to take the time to fully assess what is being put on the table to make sure that we maintain the coherence that we've been mentioning and the compatibility. Again, on WTO, one quick deliverable that could be achieved a few years time still, but still it would be on e-commerce, the huge negotiation there. And here again, we agree that it could be a good proof of what the WTO could deliver and really manage to have an agreement, but we need to take the time to see how the new rules that we're proposing, if we look, for instance, there are rules on source code, which could have an impact on the EU's ability to regulate artificial intelligence. Well, we need to take the time to have proper impact assessment, for example, of this. And when it comes to US cooperation agenda, it all seems fine, sustainability, digital, and health. But again, we need to see who will be involved in there, how will civil society and parliament will be able to give some feedback on this, to make sure it's going in the right direction and that it will deliver to all.
And let me stick with you as we move on to the final subject, which is to do with greening and the environment. Now, one thing that's really struck me in the last few years is how there are certain subjects, and investor-state dispute settlement was one, which no one really saw coming and then suddenly blew up into a huge issue. And if anything, it's been slightly surprising to me that the environment hasn't blown up into a huge issue within trade. You know, you can easily imagine a campaigner with the skill of Greta Thunberg or someone suddenly turning their attention on trade, and suddenly everyone is focusing on the environment. What do you think the potential is for that to happen? Are we potentially going to see environment going to dominate everything that the EU trade policy does in the way that ISDS did in the last few years?
But I see we already see it happening in the debate around the ratification of the EU-Mercosur agreements. No, I think another matter linked to the environment that will pop up also in the debate will be around trade and sustainable development. And you know, the whole idea of the chapters that has been mentioned is part of SKY. And in the strategy, for instance, we see that there will be a new study on trade and sustainable development chapter, which is nice, but still I think many stakeholders and most of the member of parliaments were expecting actually concrete actions. So this will be, this is likely to be the big debate around the implementation of the trade policy review.
Okay, thank you. Susan, let me ask you this question about greenery, which is the US obviously is deciding what it wants to do with carbon and carbon pricing, and that's something that your members are having to look at. And the EU has been talking about a carbon border tax for some time. Now, you know, you could look at this as something that is helping or help the US ease towards its own system of carbon pricing, or you could look at it as a protectionist tool, which is the way that the previous Trump administration looked at it. How do you think your company is looking at the EU and the green agenda at the moment in terms of their ability to trade with the EU?
Well, firstly, we're looking at it positively because we definitely believe this has to be a pillar, again, supportive of the Green Deal being a major focus also for economic recovery. I think it's important to say that US companies, you know, invested here for many, many years. They are also huge contributors to that green progress that we're making in Europe with regard to investments here and technology and research and development and coming up with innovation to further us in that respect. So we're very supportive of that. I mean, you mentioned, I mean, we see the sort of green transition as being an area also of competitive advantage also for the EU. As I said, you know, US companies are benefiting, but also EU companies are. So we also should cooperate. So we're seeing overall, it goes back to this general theme of cooperation as well. Now, you mentioned the carbon border adjustment mechanism in particular. Yes, we're watching that very closely. I mean, it's going to happen. We would say, yeah, that something should be happening because you need a level playing field. Something has to be done to make it fair. You can't have a situation where companies are investing in areas in a jurisdiction where carbon emission standards are lower outside and then importing back in. It's just no good for anyone, for European or US companies. So something has to be done about that. So we believe that you know, there has to be a tool that's put into place we would be, what we're concerned about is this level playing field. So with regard to US companies, so it has to be WTO compatible. It has to be, something international. An international tool would be the best way forward. There are various designs being proposed at the moment. One of those is being based around the ETS, the emissions trading system. So that will be our current preference. Otherwise, to be honest, if you look sort of into this just generally, we're going to have irritant. It was what we would call a trade irritant. This has to be addressed properly. Otherwise, it's going to have impact on, if we go back to trade policy, with regard to adding to the list of trade irritants that we already have, and we don't want to go into those now, but this would just be an additional one. And so, let's keep that list as small as possible. Just actually maybe just related, but just to pick up on a couple of points that were made, but maybe we can come back to that, Alan. I wanted to mention, about sort of transparency, indeed, to Léa's point, if I may, about impact assessments and just generally. You need to bring the public along, and maybe we can come back to that later in any of this. I totally agree with you. There has to be transparency, Léa. And with any of this, with any strategies that we may have, we have to bring the public along with us. Otherwise, you can have the best strategy in the world, but it's really not going to get anywhere. And related to the sort of sustainability question there, Alan, just flicking back, I wanted to mention due diligence. I think it's sort of, again, related to this sort of trend of needing the public to be coming along, whether you have CBAM or whatever you have. There is a trend now for companies to be stepping up and really looking at the impacts that all of this have down the supply chain, but also whether it's on society, on human rights and so forth. And I just want to flag up that business is taking this very seriously. There is a definite trend towards this, and it was, I believe, mentioned somewhere in the strategy. SCG is the great acronym. So just want to flag that up in this in order to promote, it's very important for business to promote sustainable and responsible value chains. The strategy is proposing mandatory due diligence, and business will take this very seriously. Thank you.
So Iuliu, this question of environment in the parliament, how big a deal breaker is this? I realize you have a green bloc who do almost never vote for any deal. And you have people on your side, on the centre right, who are are keen on voting for deals, and then you have the sort of moderates in the centre left. Something like Mercosur, for example, do you think the environmental concerns in Mercosur that Léa mentioned, are those an absolute deal breaker? Is it the case that without big changes or big action on environment, something like Mercosur will not get through the parliament?
Well, Alan, I think that it would be a huge simplification if we talk about the green objectives or the environmental objectives as being only for the political side of the Greens. It's hugely important for all the political groups, and it's a topic more and more debated. Of course, there are also those colleagues, and I count myself in that group, who are always reminding about the issues of competitiveness and the issues of the need to really have some implementation studies, some impact studies, really need to talk about figures and about economic relevance. For example, in one previous statement of her or intervention of her, Susan mentioned jobs and workers, emphasis on workers in the US trade strategy. And it would be also an emphasis in our approach to these issues, because, for example, in the EPP, we have now the slogan of this year in the times of economic recovery, which would be jobs, jobs, jobs. And I just saw this morning an Eurostat release about joblessness in the EU, which is over 7%. But the needs for jobs for young people is huge, because there we have over 17% joblessness among young people. So what we have to pair with these issues of environment, we have to pair them with innovation, research and development, and make a package also of various policy tools and incentives. And I will give you just one example about day-to-day realities, I would say, yes, the European Union, 27 member states, huge differences among the member states. So very clearly, if we address at EU level those environmental priorities, we have to find the right accompanying measures for companies to implement, for the public to treat all this issue in a realistic manner. If I look to some regions in Eastern Europe, be it my country, Romania, or other Eastern European regions, and I make a comparison with some other regions in the European Union, which are already very far away in terms of green energy, of innovation, of research and development spending, on innovation spending, then I would say that trade policy is by far not enough to tackle those issues and to answer those questions. We have to enter in very complex challenges, including, for example, changing of mentalities and giving the right information and entering in the field of communication campaigns. I always discuss with companies who come to, to discuss various things with me. And I tell them, look, you have to go in the communication campaigns battlefield to inform people about realities. If we say 1 in 6 jobs in the European Union comes from foreign trade, from foreign activity, that would be something that people can feel really in their own regions. So for this, we need also a new type of activism, not only from the environmental activists, but also on behalf of the companies and of the people who are really creating jobs, who are the investors and the entrepreneurs.
Okay, so finally on this point, Ignacio, can I bring that up? Trade for all, and Léa and Susan both brought up the issue of transparency. And one thing about trade for all was becoming more transparent and addressing critics and so forth. If you have a trade policy that is focused more on security and foreign policy and geopolitics, is there the same potential? How do you keep, the public who may not be as interested in that day to day engaged in trade policy and supportive of what the EU is trying to do?
Well, let me start by questioning a little bit your premises that this is a trade policy which is going to be more focused on security and on issues which are not of great public policy concern. Now, if you look into the questions which are going to be part of the task of modernizing the WTO, this is going to be the question about how to mainstream sustainability into all the activities of the WTO, including to the activities of the Activity Committee. I don't think that you need to change the rules. You need to see how you can mainstream sustainability considerations throughout the WTO system. It is going to be about how to ensure a level playing field when it comes to competition with countries where the state plays an important role. Again, a very politically issue. Digital trade attracts a lot of interest by consumer organizations and not only by consumer organizations. And the whole sustainability dimension, as you have quite rightly said, is very much at the center of this new European trade policy. This is undoubtedly the greenest trade policy communication that has ever been published by the European Union. It looks into the issue of sustainability, both from the multilateral point of view, from the point of view of what impact it should be on our bilateral trade negotiations, and also in terms of the autonomous instruments that we need to develop. So all of those issues are issues of great public interest, of great public concern. And I would very much agree with what Mr. Winkler has said. The center of political gravity in the European Parliament now is very much on the issue of sustainability. It's going to be very difficult to see how you can take any significant trade policy initiative if you cannot show that it is also contributing towards sustainable development objectives. So this issue of sustainability is going to be quite central to European Union trade policy, and that's a political reality which I think we in DG Trade need to absolutely be able to address. Which brings me to the question of transparency. Now, I don't think it would be a correct perception that because trade for all had all these elements relating to transparency, and there's perhaps less being said in this communication that implies any shift on policy. On the contrary, I think that we take all the steps that we took since trade for all as a given. It's very clear that the European Union trade policy needs to be fully transparent in all its aspects. And I take the point from Léa that what we need to bear in mind is that trade policy is going to be less about negotiating bilateral trade agreements. There are still some important negotiations going on, and there may well be others in the future, but it's going to be less central in terms of what trade policy is all about. It's going to be much more about multilateral negotiations. We have a different dynamic from bilateral negotiations. It's going to be much more about how you implement trade agreements, which also, by the way, includes the issue of regulatory cooperation activities. And it's going to be of critical importance that all of those activities also have the same degree of transparency that we have been developing over time when it comes to bilateral trade negotiations. And that implies also seeing how we better interact with civil society on issues relating to the multilateral trade policy and on issues relating to implementation and enforcement. Now, I was very happy that Léa was referring to our experience on Canada, because I remember when we concluded CETA, there were a lot of anxiety about having created a regulatory cooperation committee in the context of the trade agreement, that it was actually going to imply that regulators would not be able to exercise control of regulatory discussion, that it was also going to result in lack of transparency. And I hope that Léa can confirm that that has not been at all the case. I mean, this regulatory cooperation committee has been quite useful in incentivizing cooperation among the regulators. It has resulted on some steps forward in terms of regulatory cooperation. And all of this has been done in a manner which is fully transparent, which is clear understanding about what is the work which is being developed in the context of this regulatory cooperation committee. And the more that we engage in those type of activities, the more I think that we would need to be sure that we keep full transparency of all the activities which are being developed. On the particular issue of the Trade and Technology Council, the issue that so far there's not much to be transparent about. This was basically an idea that was agreed with the previous US administration, and we are still now discussing with the new administration to identify to what extent this is also something that they wanted to take forward. We still haven't got a reaction from the Biden administration on this, so that's the reason why we haven't yet said a lot, because we are still very much evaluating to what extent the new administration would want to take this forward. But I'm sure that once this is cleared, there would certainly be a willingness on our side to be very transparent about how this work is being conducted, particularly so far as it may also tackle with some issues which are of a regulatory nature. I mean, as you know, the Trade and Technology Council is supposed to have quite a broad mandate. It's also a place where you can discuss some issues relating to investment screening, etc. But it also has potentially a dimension of regulatory cooperation, particularly in the digital sphere.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have 7 or 8 minutes for questions. One question from Fraser Cameron that's directed at Susan, I guess others, but I guess Susan initially. Given US domestic politics, how likely is it that President Biden will be able to pursue a genuine multilateral approach, issues like tariffs on EU steel and so forth?
Yeah, it's the burning question that everyone's been asking since the Biden administration came in. I mean, I think the jury's out on that. However, I think we've seen very positive signs. I think what we've seen so far, you know, there've been some domestic comes first. I think that's clear. And in our conversations with those who are in the US administration and so forth, but it is clear that the focus is on domestic. So absolutely. I would say, secondly, it's not back to how it was under President Obama. I think we should recognize that. It's not, even though after the domestic issues have gone through, it doesn't mean to say it's just going to jump back to how it was before. So it's definitely not going to be easy. However, the signals are very strong and positive, I believe, with various executive orders that have been made, the Biden administration coming back into the Paris Climate Agreement immediately. I think they're very strong. The WHO, We've now got a new set gen of the WTO as well. So I think there's some very strong signals there. So we remain positive. I can't answer Fraser's question completely on this, but I think the waiting game now, we're waiting for still some senior figures to be put in place. Catherine Tai, USTR, is about to be confirmed any day. Gina Raimondo, US Secretary of Commerce, was confirmed yesterday. So now we're on the path. I think the important message here I would like to stress is there a sense of urgency. I think great signs from the EU. This is not a time to just sit back and wait for the US to take leadership again. This is a different scenario. It's time for urgency. You've got midterms coming up in only, less than 2.5 years. So we have not got much time to wait. So we need to, what we're saying is sort of really put all our emphasis into resetting that relationship between EU and US, refreshing multilateralism, absolutely, as everyone said, and let's rekindle this EU-US leadership that is really vital. So if we do all that, we've got some hope there.
Okay. Let me move on to another question then, which is about digital trade and data from Isabel Rocha from the Software Alliance. Maybe Ignacio could address this one. The EU talks a lot about digital trade and data, and your particular director at DG Trade is very keen on putting data flows and so on into trade agreements. Other DGs are perhaps less keen on putting personal data and so on up for international negotiation. And some member states are much keener on having rules on data flows than others. Given these differences of opinion within the EU, what role can the EU practically play on the issue of data localization, data flows, and so on?
Well, Alan, yeah. So the beauty of having a trade policy communication like this one is that it is a statement of the college. It has been agreed following intensive discussion by all parts of the European Commission, and we present a consensus view of the college about how we should be tackling the issues relating to data, the issues relating to localization requirements. And if you actually read the communication, I think it will be very clear our position about the concerns relating to localization requirements. That's something that we have been tackling in our trade agreements, no doubt whatsoever. All our trade agreements include commitments as far as localization requirements. And when it comes to the issue of data flows, our position has always been very, very clear. Anything that can be said about data flows in the trade agreement has to be based on an absolute guarantee that there will be no questioning of the data privacy regime of the European Union. And that, I think, is a fundamental principle that we basically agree among all parts of the European Commission. And I can assure you that on this issue, DG Trade and DG Just work very, very closely together whenever issues relating to data are discussed in any trade context. And I think also the message which is coming from this communication is that we should not necessarily be defensive. I think there is a lot of scope for regulatory cooperation in the digital sphere. This is something that we would also want to see how we can discuss with like-minded countries some of the challenges relating to the digital economy. There are a lot of challenges relating to artificial intelligence. There are a lot of challenges relating to how to ensure that digital platforms are properly regulated, and all those are issues on which we would want to engage in a discussion with like-minded countries. Of course, with the United States, that's one of the issues that we would hope to be able also to discuss within the framework of this Trade and Technology Council. But all of this being very, very clear, we would never agree on anything which can in any way compromise data privacy, which is a fundamental right in the European Union.
Okay. I should add, by the way, that the remarks about different directorates were me spicing up the question. That wasn't actually the question. It wasn't actually the question. That's before I get very respectful people into trouble. That was me being incredibly provocative. Right, we only have a minute or so left. Let me ask Iuliu, in 20 seconds, if someone said to you, come on, this is just an inward-looking EU-first trade strategy, isn't it? How would you say, no, it isn't?
Well, I would simply say no, it isn't, because we just discussed here 1 hour about the implications of the trade strategy and the importance of the word open. And I think it was Susan that elaborated on this at the beginning of our discussion. And then I think that what we did during this 1 hour debate was to discuss various elements, but majority of them linked to openness. Our intervention into the WTO and our hopes for the refreshed and refilled transatlantic relations, those are about openness. Our new pieces of legislation also, I think about due diligence or all the other tools in the toolbox. Of course, they are tools with the sole destination of enforcement of what we agree, because we have to have, the European Union has to have enforcement tools. I think this does not mean any breaking away of the idea of openness. Anyway, I think that it's very clear that the European Union, the EU27, continues to be the most open market in the world. I think we can clearly establish that. And we can clearly also establish the intention of the European Commission, and I would say also of many in the Parliament, that we have to maintain that openness while we have also to acknowledge the changing realities of the new trade world and the volatilities on the global trading market.
Thank you very much. And Léa, very finally, in 10 or 20 seconds, what might you expect to see in the next trade strategy in 5 years' time that you don't see here?
A concrete element to tell us how trade policy will really deliver to all, and much more concrete example also of how transparency will be mainstream everywhere and how we'll be able to really have compatibility between internal and external policy in practice.
Thank you very much. And with that, I shall hand back to Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you to all the panelists. I think we could have gone on and on and on talking about this. We will have other opportunities to do so. So thank you all for following the event, and stay tuned for the next conversations that we will have. Thank you and have a nice day.